Good evening, friends. My name is Eli Sachs. I'm the director of the program in Jewish Studies at the University of Colorado Boulder. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar with Professor Hilary Kalsman on the topic Exams in Extremis, Standardized Testing, Politics and Crisis in the Middle East. This webinar is part of our Peak to Peak series, and this is an initiative that creates conversations between CU Boulder faculty on the one hand and audiences and communities across Colorado and beyond on the other. It's supported by CU's Office for Outreach and Engagement, and it's a partnership with communities and civic organizations across Colorado. And I just want to begin by thanking all of those communities and all of those organizations. The Corazon de Trinidad Creative District, the Durango Creative District, the Garfield Public Library District, the Trinidad Carnegie Public Library, Western Colorado University, Aspen Jewish Congregation, the Boulder JCC, Kavod on the Road, and Temple Aaron in Trinidad. We're deeply grateful for your partnership. So in a moment, I'll say something more about tonight's program and about tonight's speaker. But first, I want to briefly share a few words about a member of our community and one of the first peak-to-peak speakers this semester, Professor David Schneer. As some of you know, Professor Schneer passed away just 2 weeks ago after a long battle with brain cancer. As soon as we announced the kind of new online version of the series that we've had this year, David was one of the first faculty members to reach out to me about speaking. And I don't think that was an accident. More than almost any other academic I've ever known, David was committed to the importance of community building through public scholarship, to the idea that collaboration between the academy and the broader community is crucial, especially for those of us who have the privilege of teaching at a public university like CU Boulder. For David, the task of learning and teaching and thinking was a sacred civic trust. It was a responsibility, but it was also an opportunity to help shape the conversations that define who we are and who we want to be as a society. This commitment shaped his scholarship, it shaped his teaching, it shaped his activism. I mean, I can't think of a more fitting way to honor his memory than by what we're doing here this evening, by coming together as members of CU, the academy more broadly, and the public as a whole, for an evening of learning and thinking and conversation. He's very much on our minds and in our hearts as we gather together tonight. So with that in mind, I want to say a little bit about the kinds of conversations we're going to have this evening. Those of you who have participated in one of these programs before and will have a sense of the routine, of the different ways in which we try to really kind of foster conversation in this space. So first, after tonight's speaker, Professor Kalsman presents for about 20 to 25 minutes. She and I will be in conversation with one another for another 15 to 20 minutes. Second, after that, we want to open things up for a genuine discussion, not just between me and Professor Kalsman, but really between all of you and Professor Kalsman. And you can do that via the Q&A function on your screen. So if you look kind of towards the bottom of your screen, you'll see something that says Q&A. If you click on that, you can write in a question and it will be visible to me. And I'll try to share it with Professor Kalsman and the group, and she will respond. And you don't need to wait to the end of the program to share those questions. Start adding those questions as they occur to you at any point during her presentation, at any point during my conversation with her, and we'll make sure those questions get to her. And finally, we want this to be an opportunity, not just for a conversation between me and Professor Kalsman, not even just an opportunity for a conversation between you and Professor Kalsman, but really an opportunity for conversations between you and your fellow participants. And the way to do that is with the chat function. If you click on that chat function, you can write a comment to the group as a whole. Just make sure that you set it to go to all panelists and attendees. If you just sort of set it to all panelists only, we will see it. So sort of make sure to set it to all panelists and attendees. And as I'm introducing Professor Kalsman, I would encourage you, if you haven't already done so, I see that many of you have, to write a greeting to the group. You can say who you are, where you're from, and why you decided to participate tonight. This is a community of learning. This is a community of thinking. This is a community of growing. And the way you build community is through those kinds of connections. Okay, so none of you want to hear me talk, so let me introduce tonight's speaker. Professor Hilary Kalsman is an assistant professor of history and the endowed professor of Israel/Palestine studies in the program in Jewish studies here at C Boulder. She's also now magically on your screen. She holds a BA from Brown University and a PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. And her research interests include education, colonialism, and state and nation building in Israel, Palestine, as well as in the broader Middle East. Her current book project is entitled Schooling the State, Education in the Modern Middle East. And it sort of rethinks and re-narrates the history and politics of the modern Middle East by exploring links between education, teachers' professionalization, and political activity across the region. She also recently began a new project analyzing the history of standardized testing in Israel, Palestine, Jordan, and Iraq. We'll hear about some of that research tonight. And her work has been supported by numerous organizations. We don't have time for me to mention all of them. There's the American Council of Learned Societies, there's the National Academy of Education, there's the American Academic Institute in Iraq, and there are many others as well. And last year, she was also a non-resident fellow at the Middle East Initiative, which is part of the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at the Harvard Kennedy School. With that, please join me in welcoming tonight's presenter and my friend, Professor Hilary Kalsman.
Thank you, Eli. I wanted to thank everyone for coming and the program in Jewish Studies, particularly Eli and Linda Park, the program manager, for organizing the event. I also just wanted to say that that sort of David Schneer was an incredible presence in both the Jewish Studies and History department, and his loss is really incalculable for those as well. Now, today I'm going to be talking about standardized testing. So when I say standardized testing, what I mean is tests which are the same for different students and taken supposedly under the same conditions and with the same materials available. During the spring and fall of 2020, the world has had to decide how much standardized testing really matters. In the US, with levels of COVID-19 rising, over 400 universities thought it acceptable to remove the SAT or the ACT as a required part of students' applications. Some universities sought to remove the test completely. Colorado's public universities and Harvard made it optional for 1 year, others for 3 years. University administrators cited the canceled SAT and ACT dates, as well as the difficulties and dangers in administering the test. In Jordan, on the other hand, thousands of students practiced for and took their matriculation exam, the Tawjihi, without incident. The main concerns were the fact that the government shut down WhatsApp and Instagram during the exam itself for the whole country. In Israel, students took a modified version of their matriculation exam, the Baglut. In Iraq and in the Occupied Territories, or Judea and Samaria, depending on who you ask, students sought to study for their baccalaureate or their Tawjihi through remote learning. Often lacking access to reliable internet and sharing devices among family members, students nevertheless studied for and took their tests. As the Palestinian Minister of Education, Awartani, stated, taking this exam with strict adherence to safety and prevention measures allowed Palestinian students to proceed to higher education around the world. In times of extremis, things we take for granted fall by the wayside, from work in an office to exercising at a gym to childcare. Yet, in these areas, students, parents, and governments believed high school leaving examinations and the futures they represented to be worth the risk. So one of the questions I'm going to ask today in my talk is, how do some standardized tests come to matter more than others? Why are students in these areas of the Middle East willing to risk so much to take these exams, whereas students in the US are not? What types of politics are involved in the creation and persistence of standardized tests? And finally, what futures can exams promise in times of crisis? So I'm going to be answering these questions by looking at this area. So these are I'm looking at Britain's mandates in the Middle East. So Iraq, Palestine, and Transjordan, which you can see on the left, and the polities or areas that succeeded them. So Iraq, and then as you can see here, Israel, Jordan, and the occupied Palestinian territories, or Judea and Samaria, again, depending on who you ask. So on the one hand, this is the area of my research. On the other hand, these are places historically where standardized tests play a really outsized role. So in these places, standardized tests have some of the highest stakes in the world. So briefly, what is a mandate? The mandates were created after World War I. Britain and France were given control of parts of the Middle East, also Africa, but that is another story, that used to belong to the Ottoman Empire. Britain and France were supposed to teach these Arab provinces of the former Ottoman Empire to be modern nation states. In reality, the mandates were used as a way of benefiting British and French strategic interests, facilitating political Zionism and eventually Israel in the Mandate for Palestine, and dividing the local population. The Mandate for Iraq lasted until 1932, Transjordan 1946, the Mandate for Palestine 1948. So why do matriculation exams in particular become so important? British officials in these areas had a few goals with education. Mainly using it to keep their populations as calm and not rebellious as possible, while creating enough local bureaucrats and teachers who spoke English in order to make their governments run cheaply. This means they preferred a selective, even meritocratic education, but the idea was only to have a few people with high-level education, i.e. high school, as the British were afraid that if there were too many of them and not enough jobs, they would rebel, and that would be expensive. Exams, particularly high school leaving exams, were an easy way of accomplishing this. You could either not fund very many schools at the level necessary to prepare students to take the exam, manipulate the test score required to pass, or just make the test more difficult. When the British left, the governments of Iraq, Jordan, and Israel recognized that exams were both popular and could restrict access to upper levels of schooling. Particularly for Israel and Jordan, faced with incorporating a large Palestinian population, the Baglut and the Tawjihi became important tools in trying to prevent Palestinian rebellion. However, just having a colonial or repressive purpose isn't enough to explain exams' popularity, especially in comparison with the United States. So in these areas, lots of people didn't like exams. Educators and school principals often fought the exams in order to retain control over curricula and their jobs. Educational experts complained that these exams encouraged memorization and discouraged critical thinking. However, from the 1920s through the present, parents and students believed it was worth the perhaps deadly risk to take exams because of the possibility exams offered. These exams promised to objectively measure students' mastery of globally recognized knowledge. Becoming one of the select few students who passed these exams meant students could gain white-collar employment or attend a university. These exams were recognized both nationally and internationally. They also unloaded the responsibility for success on the exam onto the shoulders of students, parents, and teachers. This combination of supposed objectivity, individual achievements, allowed exams to spread, even if the exams could be used for more nefarious purposes. So the other thing to keep in mind is that the alternatives to these exams were even more prohibitive of social mobility. So for example, only allowing students to attend vocational schools meant no chance at a middle-class future. Educational experts, particularly those from or trained in the US, complained that academic tests like the Tawjihi and the Baglut weren't well suited to Middle Eastern students' environments or job prospects. They sought instead to push students into employment, creating the specific kinds of workers they felt each society needed and would maintain the political status quo. However, students and their families preferred to take universal academic tests to try to improve their status. So what I'm going to show in the rest of my talk today is that exams came to be through politics, promising futures as well as addressing educational needs. So in this talk, I'm going to focus on a few vignettes or moments of crisis in order to talk about these exams. So during World War I, British and Indian troops seized control of Iraq from the Ottoman Empire. Initially seeking to annex the area, in April of 1920, the British accepted the mandate for Mesopotamia, Iraq, along with the mandates for Transjordan and Palestine. Iraqis, rightly fearing they would be subject to British colonialism, rebelled. Iraq's Sunni and Shia Muslims worked together to try to expel British forces. Britain embarked on an indiscriminate aerial bombing campaign. So in the British report on education for the 1920 to 21 school year, they noted that many schools were closed and school teachers were unable to get to their classrooms. However, even as the revolt was crushed, the British sought to implement final exams, starting with Baghdad, then moving to Mosul and Basra. So these exams, held in July of 1921, were printed in Baghdad, distributed in sealed covers, and held simultaneously according to a prearranged timetable to give candidates exactly the same opportunities. The best student in Baghdad received a score of only about 63%. So for the British, the goal with these exams was colonial, but also they hoped to increase buy-in to education. So this meant they could make education more prestigious while also making no effort to educate Iraq's entire population. Fearing that too many educated individuals would lead to rebellion, they used efficiency as an excuse to limit the number of passes. However, due to this rebellion, Britain decided to rule Iraq indirectly, installing the Hashemite monarchy. So the younger brother Faisal becomes king of Iraq, the older one king of Jordan. The British gave up control over government departments they thought were less important, including education. After 1923, control over Iraqi education fell to Iraqi citizens. So in this case, Sati al-Husri. Al-Husri was an Ottoman Arab educator and civil servant who loved French and Ottoman methods of schooling. He argued that a British system of education would not suit Iraq or Iraqis. Instead, he wanted more exams at different levels of schooling that would act less as gatekeepers to higher education and more of a way of unifying Iraq's diverse population and teaching them Arab nationalism, whether they thought themselves Arabs or no. By 1931, kids would have to take public exams to move from primary school to the intermediate level, from intermediate to preparatory, and then a baccalaureate to move to higher levels of education. These exams were required of all of Iraq's children, whether they were in private, public, or foreign institutions. So for the British in Iraq, exams had been a way of making education more prestigious, but also to limit the number of educated individuals. In a country with high rates of illiteracy and a desperate need for schools and teachers, they sought to limit education to prevent, quote, creating a class of semi-educated babus. So this is a term for Indian civil servants, but here it's obviously derogatory. However, for Sati al-Husri, exams were a way of bringing students together, improving the future of Iraq by unifying its population. This power of exams as a means of unity only increased over time. In 1958, when Iraqi Brigadier General Abdul Karim Qasim overthrew Iraq's British-backed Hashemite monarchy, he passed all students in the country in celebration of the revolution and the founding of the Iraqi Republic. Despite rejecting the monarchy of Iraq and many of its principles, the new Republic of Iraq kept and strengthened exams, particularly the baccalaureate. In Transjordan and in Palestine, the British held more control over education. So this meant the processes of creating and implementing exams were also pretty complicated. So Transjordanian students took Palestine's matriculation exam with some changes through the 1940s. So for Transjordanians, it was a really elite process to take the exam. So you had to pay a fee, and you also had to be able to travel to a city. So for example, the parents of the future Prime Minister Abdul Salam al-Majali, who was from a wealthy family in Kerak that's about 135 kilometers south of Amman, which is where the matriculation was held. So his parents rented him and his school fellows a house to be able to walk to the exam, so they could saunter past the Roman Colosseum on foot to take their test. But this eliteness of the exam increased its prestige and value. So the idea was you too could become elite if you could actually get yourself to be able to take this exam. So how do we get the Palestine matriculation exam? In Palestine, the Palestine Board of Higher Studies, PBHS, from 1923, offered Palestine's matriculation exam along with a few others. This board was an assortment of persons from a variety of institutions, including the British-run Mandate Department of Education, missionary schools, the Yeshuv, which is Palestine's Jewish community, schools of archaeology, and others. So in a mandate where the Yeshuv and the Palestinian Arab majority had totally separate school systems, this was one of the few places where Arab and Jewish intellectuals and educators met. So members of this organization understandably clashed over the content of exams. They also usually graded them, except for one university level exam, which they sent to faculty abroad, including C.S. Lewis at Oxford. So the exams, as the attendees of the first meeting of the PBHS decided, were supposed to cultivate the mind and be adapted to the needs of Palestinians. So Palestinians would supposedly have an exam tailored to their particular needs, and one which would let them study in Palestine rather than going abroad. However, the only university level institutions in the mandate wanted their own exams, Hebrew University and the Technion. And so both of these institutions taught eventually in Hebrew. So the Palestine Board of Higher Studies reached out to the nearby American University of Beirut, which recognized the exam as permitting admittance to the sophomore class, as did universities in Northern England. So the exam became international. Also, its results were published in local newspapers. Over time, the exam got harder and harder. Colonial figures kept the exam difficult in part due to their own pet standards of intelligence and achievement, particularly on papers in English, Latin, or Greek. They wanted exams to be something only elites did. While a matriculation standard was something to be celebrated, it was, excuse me, it was not to become common enough to produce a well-trained, confident, politically frustrated unemployed. However, this difficulty and exclusivity of the exam made it appealing. So for example, Ahmed Sameh Khalidi, who was an Arab Palestinian proponent of intelligence testing and the principal of one of the few schools in Palestine that prepared students for this exam, believed in selecting a Palestinian elite. Like other Arab Palestinian nationalists, he hoped to advance Arab Palestinian society. The Palestinian matriculation exam, with its increasing difficulty over time, public nature, and admittance to university or white-collar employment, could both certify and find an elite based on merit rather than aristocrat birth. The Yishuv, on the other hand, had totally different goals for examinations. They wanted a more Zionist exam, which would encourage students to stay in the new Jewish national system of education. They were afraid that if students took the Palestine matriculation exam, they would study abroad. The mandate government also wanted to use exams as a way of controlling the mostly autonomous Hebrew system of education. I can explain more how education works in the mandate for Palestine if you're interested. In 1929, the mandate government stopped certifying schools without their students taking the Palestine matriculation exam. The Hebrew public school system rebelled. Practically, they argued the mandate and the Hebrew systems were different. The Palestine matriculation measured a grade level below the final year of Hebrew secondary schools. But a larger concern was creating nationalist and Zionist curricula. So for example, the principal of the Herzliya Hebrew Gymnasia refused to comply with the exam, complaining that it lacked Hebrew subjects. So instead, Hebrew secondary schools created their own competing examination, which allowed students to go only to Hebrew University and a little later to the Technion. These mostly written exams were much easier than Palestine's matriculation exam. So Israel's Bagrut that we know today came out of these competing exams, although they would be influenced by the standards and subjects of the Palestine matriculation exam. So what we see here is that exams can play different roles while still becoming popular and important. The Bagrut, like the later exams of Iraq, was supposed to unify a population. However, it was also supposed to keep as many Jewish students as possible in Palestine, taking an easy and more Zionist exam instead of the difficult, and as we'll see, sort of crucially rigorous Palestinian matriculation. In 1936, Arab students, despite long hours of preparation, refused to take the Palestine matriculation exam. So in solidarity with a general strike and rebellion, which took place at the time against the policies of the British government and against Zionism, students protested by refusing to take the test. So one student at the Anglican St. George's School wrote to the Zionist daily English language newspaper, the Palestine Post, saying that the Arab candidates were all present, but they refused to sit for the exams. The one and only reason being their solidarity with the people who since 90 days are striking as a measure of protest against a policy of the establishment of a Jewish national home in this country at the expense of the Arab existence. About 55 of the Arab candidates submitted a letter with their signatures to the Board of Higher Studies, asking to postpone the matric till the strike is over. So what the student also emphasized is that his school fellows were part of the general strike, but they wanted to suspend the exam, not to get rid of it altogether. The following year, after the general strike ended, and in the midst of the Arab revolt in Palestine, students returned to their exams. While Arab guerrillas attacked British and Jewish forces, and the British retaliated with mass arrests and demolition of villages, exams continued. The promise of a job with a mandate bureaucracy, going to a university, having one's name published in the paper meant the exam continued, despite the country, for all intents and purposes, becoming a war zone. So one of the other things to keep in mind is that the Palestine Matriculation Exam is not the only exam available in Palestine. The London and Cambridge Matriculation Exams, which would allow you admittance to universities in England, were taken at various centers in the country. So preparation for these exams and also professional certifications in commerce, secretarial work, bookkeeping were frequently advertised in the Palestine Post. So individuals chose exams based on their imagined futures. So before COVID, I interviewed the mathematician Julian Busgang. He was born in 1925 in Poland, escaped the Holocaust, and moved briefly through Palestine in the 1940s. He chose to take a British examination, and actually would take a Polish one later, as he had no intention of remaining in Palestine. He saw economic opportunities elsewhere, and at least in hindsight, as he claimed, had no interest in living under a socialist government. By the end of the Mandate for Palestine, the importance of exams was entrenched. In the midst of the civil war between Arab and Jewish Palestinians that preceded Israel's War of Independence and Palestinians' Nakba, or catastrophe in 1948, bombings and guerrilla attacks were common. The roof had been blown off of one of the schools in which the last Palestine Matriculation Exam was held. Yet, students chose to take the test. For example, Shafiq al-Hout, a future member of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, chose to take the exam, thereby missing the funeral of his older brother who had been killed in the fighting. In this war zone, al-Hout wrote, "The most important challenge was to take the final exams." So what happens with independence, and particularly for Palestinians? Palestinians living in the West Bank and Gaza have been under the control of multiple and at times overlapping regimes, of Egypt, of Jordan, and of Israel, coupled with the Palestinian Authority. In 1948, Palestinians living in Gaza and the West Bank would become integrated into not only the regimes, but also the tests of Egypt and Jordan, respectively. As we have seen, Jordan already had used the Palestine matriculation. Palestinians now in Jordan expected the matriculation standard to be respected and continued under Jordanian rule. The Jordanian government, having annexed the West Bank and making its Palestinian population citizens, was afraid that an educated, unemployed Palestinian population could lead to political instability. It used standardized tests to limit the number of students advancing to higher grades of schooling. So the scores on exams required to enter the first grades of secondary education, the government decided they would be relative rather than absolute. So what this meant is the Ministry of Education could, on a yearly basis, deny students the opportunity to study at higher levels. So for example, in 1958, the ministry reduced the number of students going to one of the middle levels of schools by 25%. The exams, particularly the Tawjihi, became a crucial government tool, but one also desired by Jordan's population, as it allowed admittance to Jordanian and other universities throughout the Arab world. After 1967, when Israel gained control over Palestinian students in Gaza and the West Bank, exams meant a way to limit and control those students' futures. For example, in annexing East Jerusalem, Israeli government officials sought to compel students to take the Israeli Baglut. This exam was not recognized by Arab governments and thus would compel students to attend Israeli universities. Students and teachers actually went on strike in the early 1970s, demanding that the Jordanian curriculum and the Tawjihi be preserved. So today, schools and students in East Jerusalem have a choice to take either the Israeli Baglut, which is being pushed by the Israeli government, or Jordan's Tawjihi. So likewise, after the Oslo Accords, the Palestinian Authority created their own Tawjihi. asserting sovereignty through exams, if not actually through independence. Exams then were a way of marking territory, of trying to bind students' futures to one area. As mentioned, though, exams were a way of limiting those futures too. So the Bagult's proponents argued that it was a great equalizer, as all Israeli high school students took the same exam at the same time. However, Arab students often failed Israel's Bagrut, so 97% of Palestinian Arab citizens of Israel who took the exam in 1955 failed. So Jewish students would receive a magen, or protective grade. So whether they get a matriculation standard on the exam depends on both their Bagrut scores and their grades, making the tests a bit less high stakes. Students at Arab schools did not receive this protective grade. In addition, Jewish students learned English as a second language. Arab students learned both Hebrew and English, and often English not at a sufficient level to pass the exam. This meant the Bagrut could, in fact, be a tool to keep Palestinian citizens of Israel or residents out of higher education. A government report in 1976 noted that if the reception criteria for Jewish university students, including exams, was applied at the same level and meticulously to Arab students as well, the number of students would successfully be reduced, thereby preventing integration and political rebellion. The exam then was not only a chance to regulate curricula, but also to regulate who was able to go on to university. From the 1920s to today, exams have maintained a crucial role in the futures of young people throughout this region. Across various crises, wars, regime change, shifts in sovereignty, and now COVID-19, the Bagrut, the Tawjihi, and Iraq's baccalaureate exam remain. They came to matter so much due to exams' capacity to regulate admittance to upper levels of schooling, to unify populations and control curricula, and due to their promises of objectivity and advancement based on ability rather than patronage or social status. Colonial and national politics converged in the creation of these exams. Today, students are waiting to see what will happen. One student, Alimi in Jordan, felt relief after she took the Tawjihi despite COVID, as she approved of the physical distancing, temperature-taking gloves, and face masks required, as she hoped that her score would be high enough. In Iraq, students who had been out protesting their government's corruption during the winter found themselves desperately studying at home under lockdown, waiting hours for their lectures to load on the slow internet their country provides. Gohar, a Jewish Israeli student, on the other hand, worried that his cohort would fail to be prepared to the Bagrut due to learning over Zoom. He felt his teachers weren't able to teach efficiently and quickly enough to prepare, and that, quote, "At this pace, a lot of students won't be able to pass the Bagrut." He added, "In another few years, our generation won't be ready for work, so that when we come looking for jobs in high tech, they'll tell us, 'You're from the coronavirus generation.'" We also do not know what the future will bring. What we have seen, however, is that for students in the Middle East, high-stakes testing with its shifting purposes and effects has become a part of life across crises. So thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
So thank you so much, Professor Kalisman, for that presentation, one that I think has sort of tremendous resonance with the kind of situation in which so many of us find ourselves in the United States and across the world today. So I have a few questions that I'm selfishly going to ask you now, but I just want to sort of encourage all of our attendees to, if you have questions, you can already begin putting those in the Q&A function. If you put them in the chat function, we will see them as well, and I'll make sure that those get to Professor Kalsman. And I guess sort of my first question for you is I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about how you came to be interested in this topic, or sort of why it hasn't received as much attention in the past and why you found yourself wrestling with it today.
Well, so I came across it actually in my first project, which is looking at public school teachers in these areas. And it was within that project that I actually came across that story of Shafiq al-Hout, right, who is sitting with, sort of, again, in the middle of a war zone, And he passes his exam. He finds out that he passes as a refugee in Beirut and is actually able to launch a university career and then later go into politics. And so one of my questions was like, wow, why is this exam, why does it become so important? Why is it so crucial? Also, having lived briefly in Jordan, you can also see this in East Jerusalem when the results of these exams are announced, like the country erupts in gunfire and celebrations. It's sort of one of the few national holidays. And so what I wanted to know is how do we get here? And so almost all of the literature on standardized testing is much more concerned with whether or not standardized tests are good or bad, right? So it's this sort of, they discourage critical thinking, they're ill-suited to students, again, they cause anxiety, but there isn't very much on sort of, well, why do we have them in the first place? And also how could they be a political tool? And I would say a lot of the literature on standardized testing is dominated by studies of the US, even though in the US standardized testing works very differently. But like particularly after No Child Left Behind, you had a lot of people writing about, sort of the problems with standardized tests for schools. Do they actually predict anything about students' future performance, et cetera? So I wanted to get sort of more into, well, again, how do we end up with them? Why do they become popular, especially when people seem to be using them for different reasons?
So that's fascinating. I want to pick up on that theme of sort of the differences between the U.S. on the one hand, maybe the context that kind of most of us in this webinar are most familiar with, and the sort of Middle East on the other, right? So I think you've really been stressing the differences between those contexts, and that seems very persuasive, right? As someone who grew up in a New York City context where people were overly obsessed with SAT scores, it's hard to imagine a national holiday of kind of receiving your grades. I'm wondering though if you could talk about, are there any similarities you see between the role of standardized testing in the Middle East and the role of standardized testing here in the United States? Are there analogs in the Middle East to any of the controversies we see about standardized testing in the US, or are these contexts just sort of so radically different that we don't see that kind of overlap?
So there is some overlap between sort of like the SATs and these sort of matriculation exams. Whereas, I mean, again, like you do also have, parents cheating, right? Like, you've had the most recent scandals about people trying to get their kids into college and sort of trying to find ways to cheat on these sort of particular tests. So those do act in part as a gatekeeper to higher studies, but their role is really so much less. So in the countries I'm looking at, your grade on the test determines not just whether you can attend a university, but what you can major in, right? So you have to get a high score if you want to be pre-med or engineering, a lower score actually if you want to be a teacher. So they're really determinative. But I would say in Israel, recently they actually have added another test, which like they nicknamed the American test. It's like the psychomentally. And so this is like a multiple choice test, which ends up being actually like an added hurdle to be able to go to university too. So I would say like there's some influence of American methods. But I think the main thing that I've seen in my research is just this sort of incredible criticism on the part of American educational experts or people from these countries who go to the US and get trained against these exams, sort of saying it's just rote memorization, it's not fitting students to the workforce like they should be, et cetera.
Well, I want to sort of pick up at you on that question of kind of criticism and controversy for a moment. And I'm saying I'm already seeing some fantastic questions in the chat and in the Q&A at you precisely about some of these comparative issues. So I'm going to kind of save that kind of topic for the audience Q&A, and actually maybe after this question turn already to the audience Q&A given some of the questions we're getting. But I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about maybe this sort of less prominent strand of critique and controversy surrounding these tests in the Middle East. I mean, I sort of heard you saying that we haven't seen the same kind of controversy in the Middle East surrounding these tests that we've seen in the US, but you also did in your presentation allude to moments or streams or strands of controversy. There's that powerful moment of a student strike. You talked earlier about protests by educators or educational experts. I was wondering if you could say a little bit about the kind of maybe less prominent history of dissent in the Middle East relating to these exams. What are the kinds of controversies that have existed? What are the kinds of dissenting voices that have emerged? And what did the pushback look like? How did these controversies get resolved? To what extent have they been resolved?
So the thing is, pretty early on, like most of the people who are, sort of wanting their kids to take the tests are not criticizing them or protesting them. They will complain about them, right? This sort of, now like we have to make sure our kid studies all the time, and they will also complain if the tests are not fair, right? So if they're not fairly administered, if they're not fairly graded, but sort of as these tests are taking hold, there's not a lot of people who are, sort of like parents and students who are saying no tests. Because again, the test is something you can actually sort of work on and then get really, sort of really tangible benefits. But again, like the protests you see are really coming from educators who don't like the fact that they are having to, as they put it, teach to the test. And one of the really interesting things is that recently in Jordan, there's actually another option where, so previously it was, sort of the main way people would be able to go to Jordanian universities is you do well on the Tawjihi exam and then you get accepted. And there's like a thing that like sorts you based on your score and your preference for university. But they started making sure to leave places in university for the children of prominent people. And now there's an option where if you don't do well in the Tawjihi, you can pay. And so you pay higher tuition or you pay to go to a private university. So it's something where you're seeing, sort of the promise of fairness that the exam is sort of offering is getting offset. And I would say, in Israel, there have been a lot of complaints about the Bagrut and the psychometry exam. And again, that it's sort of, and a lot of those are about the kind of like anxiety that it promotes. But there have also, sort of been like support saying, well, because it forces students to be good in lots of different subjects, it forces students to be good in math, that it helps prepare them for sort of things that like Israel prides itself on, like the high tech that the student mentioned.
Fascinating. I have so many follow-up questions to what you just said, and I'm going to resist the temptation to ask any of them because we have a number of questions in both the chat and the Q&A. I'm going to try to kind of work through the questions thematically, and I'm going to try to get to everyone's question. If I don't get to your question, there's nothing personal. Certainly don't hold it against Professor Kalsman. I hope you won't hold it against me either. And maybe I sort of want to begin with some historical questions. So one question we received has to do with kind of the history of the aims animating these exams. And the question here is, do you think that the sort of standardized testing regime in the Middle East had an educational goal, has sort of had an educational throughout, or was it kind of a political issue from the very beginning, right? Have these always been political, or has there been a kind of shift from an educational focus to a political focus?
So I would say it's always to some extent been a combination of the two. So even these British colonial figures, who again are incredibly explicit about the fact that they don't want people to get educated because they will be a nationalist unemployed. Like they do not, like this is, they do not, hide what they're saying. They are very clear about that being the goal. And that they're learning from their experiences in India and Egypt, where they felt like that happened, that they educated too many people. But on the other hand, it's something where they do even really care about what the students were learning. So they spend a lot of time, particularly on the subjects they know well. So that Latin and Greek, you have the Assistant Director of Education, the Mandate for Palestine, working very hard to try to make sure that the level was very high. They criticize those Hebrew exams all the time for being too lax, because they feel like they're not living up to a very particular pedagogical goal. And one of the things they also emphasized is they thought the difficulty of the exams was also character building. So the fact that you had to be disciplined and study really hard for these helped produce a strong character, and even actually leadership qualities of sort of altruism. But again, the sort of thing was you could, like, sort of, and teachers involved also really cared about standards, but in the background, there's always this assumption that not that many people should pass, and not that many people should pass because then you are concerned about an unemployed educated class.
Excellent. I'm going to suggest that for any of Professor Kalsman's students watching this exam, they not just watching this webinar, they not get too worried that she just spoke about the importance of not enough of minimizing the number of people who pass these exams. Well, so building on this sort of historical question and this question about sort of the kind of constellation of educational and political aims, we have at least two questions about the kind of relationship of these sort of testing regimes to questions of sort of diversity and questions of sort of differences in terms of power. So I'm going to try to ask these questions together and invite you to reflect on them. One is a question specifically about the history of these exams in Israel-Palestine, and the other is a kind of comparative question. So the question about the history of these exams in Israel-Palestine is sort of whether sort of part of the narrative that you're telling here is that sort of, from the time of Israeli independence, what we see in the context of the testing policy is really a kind of policy that is discriminatory towards Arab students. Is that the kind of narrative that you are presenting, that you're seeing here? So that's one question. And the second question, sort of on a similar topic, has to do with relationships of power. In the US, when we think about standardized testing, in terms of relationships of power, and especially the ways in which standardized testing can result in sort of kind of exclusionary policies towards students of color. We think about this not just in terms of the levels of difficulty of these exams, but also in terms of the kinds of knowledge that's produced, the kinds of knowledge that's demanded. And do you see that as playing a role here? So I sort of, again, like the two questions are, there's a sort of question about the relationship between these exams and kind of discrimination in the history of Israeli society. And there's a question about the ways in which sort of exclusion and relationships of power are implicated here. Is that, how much of that is about difficulty? How much of it about content and types of knowledge, and what other areas are involved?
Well, so in the case of Israel, right? So like in the early years of the Israeli state, they're trying also to incorporate like a really, really large Jewish immigrant population, mainly coming from areas of the Middle East. And so, and also, right, like Israel as a country, as a new country, does not have a lot of resources. They've just fought a really difficult war that they have won, but they're, sort of, those are the issues they're wrestling with. And they still have about 20% of their population are Palestinians, now citizens of Israel. And so in the beginning, Israel is actually really going to direct its resources educationally to those Mizrahi or Middle Eastern immigrants. Because those, right, it's sort of saying like, this is a Jewish country. The groups we want to integrate that, are sort of coming in with disadvantages, those are the ones we're going to target. But I would say, right, so the Palestinian Arab population of Israel, even though they're citizens, they're still considered enemies by and large. And it's something you see in the educational system where there is real, and again, like explicit concerns in the Knesset that that if you have too many Palestinians achieving high levels of education, then will you have too many entering government, and will you lose the Jewish character of the state? And again, this is not everybody. There are debates over it. There's a debate about whether or not to allow Palestinian citizens of Israel to continue studying in Arabic or to push them to study Hebrew, and they decide to allow them that sort of cultural autonomy to teach in Arabic while very stringently controlling their textbooks. So there is actually like a concerted push to, sort of to keep the upper level of Palestinian citizens of Israel's education down. Not actually at the lower levels, like there's, sort of Israel says education's compulsory. So they do try to make sure that everybody is going to school. But again, there's that fear of sort of achieving power through education. Particularly again, in the sort of first decade or so of statehood. And again, this population is also under martial law at the time. Now, to this question about sort of content discrimination, that's a really good one. So as I mentioned, one of the things is like when you're studying for this exam, the Bagrut in Israel, so for Jewish students, you would know Hebrew, and then you would know English as your second language. So you only need to learn one, albeit a super difficult second language. So then for the Arab students, they have to learn Hebrew as well as English in order to take the exam. Whether or not the exam is translated into Arabic has actually fluctuated. And there have been complaints recently that the translation from the Hebrew exam to be able to take it in Arabic, that the translation isn't very good. And I would say in the other countries I'm looking at, one of the restrictions you see with content is also just, are students able to get a high school education at all? So, right, like the content is a sort of general like high school education. All of them involve a lot of European history, a lot of Arabic language. But one of the problems is that if you don't go to a high school that teaches up to that level, then then it's very difficult to pass the exam, including if you study on your own.
So I wanna pick up on the sort of contemporary focus that you've introduced in your answers to these two questions, with two questions, both of which relate to kind of economic issues and the sort of economic stakes of testing. One is about career trajectories in Israel. So the question here is, since most Jewish Israelis serve in the military and get additional training in the military, how does the standardized testing regimen kind of work in determining future career choices? So that's one question. And then the second question has to do with income, right? So in the United States, SAT scores, for example, are highly correlated with income. Do we see similar patterns in the Palestinian territories, in Israel? Do we see that kind of link between kind of income and performance?
Great. So to the first question, it's an added dimension. So I would say the thing is though, right? So like the military can give you a chance at networking. It can give you a chance to connect into like sort of like, and again, this sort of like particularly like a high tech career path. But the thing is, you still need to be able to go to a university, right? Like if you want to advance in a particular way. And so while, it sort of offers, again, like more opportunities, and it's something where that's also one of the reasons why you can have, it was also used, right, as like a means of integration for the Jewish population. The exams are still very important. So I would say like it's another layer. It's in certain ways like it's another sort of like hoop, another chance for Israelis to make a career, but it doesn't like, sort of erase the importance of the exam as well. And so to the income question, so that's a really interesting one, especially for the present day. I mean, I know in the early period I'm studying, so in Jordan, absolutely yes. But Jordan actually only has one high school, like for the whole country. One public high school, and it's for boys, like up through the 1940s. And so it's like, if you want to take this exam, you have to go to this high school. So most of the people able to go to this high school are from a wealthier strata, but not everyone. And so there it's sort of like your exam scores are correlated with being elite because it's very difficult to be able to take the test without being elite. But one of the very interesting things for the Arab population of the Mandate for Palestine is, if you remember, like Ahmed Sameh Khalidi from my talk, the Arab Palestinian nationalist who loves intelligence testing. So his school is completely meritocratic. So it takes the top 2 students in every single school in the Mandate, the top 2 boys, and takes them to the school, and they train all of the time. They study all of the time. They like sneak candles under their sheets to study at night, and they're the ones taking and passing the exam. So there it's actually not correlated with wealth, and it's not correlated with even being urban, which is sort of surprising. But as for today, that's something where I would need to look more into like the current studies, but of those there are much more, again, because that feeds into this question of, is this test a good pedagogical tool or not?
So, this last question asked us to reflect on, again, a kind of comparative perspective, right? Do we see trends in the United States having analogs in the Middle East? And I want to sort of conclude with a group of 2 final questions that continue that broadening and sort of ask us to see this history in a comparative question. One has to do with kind of content of the exams and these testing regimens, and the other has to do with the sort of context in which they exist. The content one has to do with sort of some specific exams. So could you sort of reflect a little bit about the kind of IB program in the United States and its similarities and differences to the kind of tests we see in the Middle East? That's the content question. And the context question has to do with, this sort of really striking level of excitement that you described as existing in the Middle East, and its level of intensity. And do we see a kind of similar intensity surrounding standardized testing anywhere else in the world, or is this relatively specific to the Middle East? Are there analogs elsewhere, or is there something about the role of these exams in the Middle East that helps generate and feed this kind of intensity?
Those are really good questions. Those are also questions that are actually sort of pushing towards research that I'm doing in the book, like particularly in sort of later chapters. So with that international baccalaureate, in many ways, it's very similar, right? Like the content actually and the sort of format are quite similar. And this is in part because the British, and then also sort of, if you remember, like Saty al-Husri, who really loves French methods, he's pulling very directly from the French baccalaureate example for Iraq. So these are sort of like essay tests. You take them over, like they're pretty long. But I would say one of the difference with the international baccalaureate is, again, it's not required, right? It's a choice, it's an option, whereas the exams I'm looking at are, I mean, again, you cannot take them, but like particularly in Jordan, it's if you don't pass the Tawjihi, like your options are incredibly limited. And so then in terms of the what was the final question? Can you tell me again?
Whether we see any kind of analog anywhere else in the world to the kind of intensity that we see related to these exams in the Middle East.
So this is one of the things I am looking at. So from what I have heard, like in India, actually, which is also sort of a British colonial legacy, there's a very similar level of sort of high stakes testing. I've also heard people discuss it in like China. But this is something that I'm looking at in order to write this book project. My first chapter is actually supposed to be kind of like a global history of the origins of standardized testing. And then we'll end with looking actually at things like the international baccalaureate and also the sort of privatization of exams and training for them.
Well, I have so many more questions, and again, I'm going to resist the temptation to ask them because we're at the end of our time together. And so first I want to just thank you, Hilary, for this really illuminating and fascinating presentation. That's kind of taken us on this sort of tour de force, not only of sort of Middle Eastern history, but on kind of educational culture kind of across the world. I also want to offer a few other words of thanks to some of the other people who made this program possible. I've already thanked all of our partners in the Peak to Peak series and the Office of Outreach and Engagement. I also want to thank Sean Wall, our tech wizard who has made this work tonight. None of you have seen him, and that's a sign that he has made things run very smoothly. And so my gratitude to Sean, to Linda Park, the program manager in the program in Jewish Studies, for all of her work putting this together, and to Danya Rivlin and Eyal Rivlin for that music you heard at the beginning, that song Shalom, which is from their album Coming Home. The Peak to Peak series is just that. It's a series. We have one more event coming up this fall on Monday, December 14th. Our colleague Yonatan Malin, a professor of music theory and Jewish studies, will be presenting on the topic klezmer music as Jewish dialogue and Jewish discourse. So I hope to see many of you at that program, and we'll have another lineup of Peak to Peak programs into the spring and the summer coming soon. You can also find recordings of all of our previous Peak to Peak programs and soon of this one on our website. And then we have other programs as well. And in particular, we're excited that we're going to have a series of programs relating to race and Jewish studies this spring. Our International Holocaust Remembrance Day speaker will be Professor Willa Johnson from the University of Mississippi. And our annual Bender visiting scholar will be Professor Bruce Haynes from University of California, Davis, and they'll be thinking about a variety of questions relating to, in Professor Johnson's case, the relationship between sort of the Holocaust and race in the United States. In Professor Haynes's case, the history of Jews of African descent in the United States. So I hope to see you there. And finally, one sort of last set of kind of words of gratitude. I've said this before, but we sort of throw around the word community a lot in academic settings. But that's really how we like to think of ourselves in the program in Jewish Studies. We are a program of learners from diverse backgrounds, diverse places in the world today, who try to think together and learn together and grow together. I know how zoomed out many of you are. I know how many Zoom options many of you have. And I just want to say thank you for joining us together this evening. The chat is open now if you, again, would like to share any words with the broader group. Again, if you set it to all panelists and attendees, it will go to everyone. We'll keep it open for a few minutes, and then we will bring the evening to a close. And really thank you again for joining us this evening.